Well, today, a lot of times you introduce people and you don't know them that well, so you have to pretend you really like them. So today it's actually a lot of fun, because I do really like the person presenting. I've gotten to know her for about, 2 years now? She's, Dr. Rezvan has been one of our postdocs in the T32 training program. What I like about her, too, she's an analyst that she came to us as, so that was pretty nice. And she's Dr. Bellin's mentee. And she's going to talk to us about missing data. And as we all know, missing data is an old problem, but as the models get more and more complex, as she'll talk about in the Africa studies with longitudinal modeling, different levels, the missing data issues certainly don't go away, and they get more complex as well. So her topic is very timely, and I'll turn it over to her.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming to this seminar. Today I'm going to talk about addressing missing data using multiple imputation in a study with multi-level data structure. In the first part of my presentation, I'm going to briefly talk about missing data in medical research. And then I'll talk briefly about multiple imputation, which is a statistical approach for handling missing data. And I will finish up the first part of my presentation by making some recommendations regarding the documentation and reporting of missing data in research, and also the multiple imputation procedure. And we'll highlight some important aspects regarding the imputation process that we need to consider and report in our research, and be clear about that in order to allow someone else to replicate our analysis. In the second part, I'm going to start with describing my case study. It's one of the South Africa studies that we have here, and it has a multi-level data structure. I'm going to talk about some limitations of a standard multiple imputation approach, and then we'll introduce two multi-level multiple imputation approach for handling missing data, and then we'll finish up with some discussion. So missing data are common in clinical, in epidemiology and clinical research, especially in long-term follow-up studies like clinical trials with repeated measure outcomes, or longitudinal observational studies. There are several statistical methods available in the literature for dealing with the missing data problem. However, previous systematic reviews highlight continuing use of inadequate statistical methods for handling missing data. One of the most common approaches for dealing with missing data problem is known as complete case analysis, which is the default option of most of the statistical software packages. This approach restricts the statistical analysis to individuals with complete data and excludes all individuals with missing data. So it can greatly reduce the sample size, which may lead to loss of precision or the statistical power. But more importantly, it can lead to biased results if, for example, the individuals with complete cases are not representative of the whole population. In any statistical analysis with missing data, we need to think about the reason of missing this. So Rubin set up a framework in which he classified 3 different missing data mechanisms. I'll briefly go through each of them. The first and most restrictive one is called missing completely at random, under which we are saying that the individuals with complete data are not different from individuals with missing data. So under this assumption, the probability of data being missing does not depend on observed or missing data. A less restrictive assumption is called missing at random, or MAR, where we're saying that the individuals with complete data are different from individuals with missing data. However, these differences can be explained by the observed data. So under this assumption, the probability of responses being missing only depend on the observed data, but conditionally but does not depend on the missing data. And lastly, missing not at random, where we're saying that the individuals with complete data are different from individuals with missing data. However, these differences cannot be explained even by the observed data. So under this assumption, the probability of responses being missing depends on the missing responses conditioning on the observed data. So in practice, we can verify whether the missing data is missing completely at random or not. However, verifying the missing at random from missing not at random assumption is not possible using the observed data at hand. So that's why performing sensitivity analysis has been suggested to explore the possible departures from the missing at random assumption. So I'm going to focus on the statistical method of multiple imputation. Multiple imputation can be taught as a two-stage process. Let's suppose that we have an incomplete data set here. Here we have like 100 subjects, and we have different measurements where the missing data is shown by the question marks. So in the first stage, missing data are replaced with multiple plausible values drawn from an appropriate statistical model, leading to multiple completed data sets. In the second stage, each completed data set is analyzed separately using a statistical method applicable to complete data. And then the obtained parameter estimates and their associated variance are combined using special rules called Rubin's rule to obtain an overall multiple imputation estimate. So most implementation of multiple imputation assumes that missing data are missing at random. The good thing about MI is that it includes all the information on the individuals that we have, but it also imputes missing data multiple times, so it accounts for the uncertainty around missing data, and in fact, it reflects the between and within imputation variability of the quantity of interest. So now we know that how multiple imputation works, and now there are two broad frameworks that we can impute missing data. So the first framework is known as fully conditional specification, or FCS, in which the missing data are drawn iteratively from a set of univariate conditional distribution, one for each incomplete data. In the second framework, which is the joint modeling, missing data are drawn simultaneously from a multivariate distribution for all incomplete data. So I'm going to talk about these two more in the second part of my presentation. A couple of years ago, we carried out a systematic review where our aim was to see how the published articles in the highly ranked journals report missing data and the important aspects of multiple imputation. So we reviewed the article published between 2008 and 2013 in the Lancet and New England Journal of Medicine, those ones that use multiple imputation in their statistical analysis. And you can see that the increasing trend of using MI over these 5 years. I also have a quick look at these two journals to see since 2014 what would be the proportion of using multiple imputation, and you can see that still, like, apparently applied researchers like to use multiple imputation.
Sorry, I didn't understand the dotted line.
These
is that
are
real data?
It's a real data, but it's not included in our systematic review. So I just did a quick search in the Lancet and New England Journal of Medicine, just looking at those articles that use multiple imputation. And this is just a number of the articles that they use multiple imputation since 2014. But these are the articles that we included in our systematic review.
It just looked that starting in 2014, there was like this giant
Yes.
increase, and I didn't know if that was real or is it just because a different method was being used. And because the way I read this picture is like, whoa, there's an explosion.
Yeah, I was actually surprised, but apparently more, it just shows that like more the articles that used multiple imputation since 2014, these two journals was just, I don't know, it just increased.
So in some respects, the software is much more available.
Yes, that's true.
So I think people are just use it.
Maybe added and required.
But because I didn't review each of the individual paper, I cannot verify that which one is the observational study and which one is the, so I just get the total number of the articles that use multiple imputation.
And that's compared to the alternative would be ignoring it, using some other method, or what?
Yeah, we don't compare with the other, because in that case we have to have the total number of, let's say, a trial that published within these years in the Lancet or New England Journal, and then we compare. But we're just focusing on those ones that use multiple imputation. And the focus was, the systematic review was to see how they report the important aspects of multiple imputation procedure. So in line with the other systematic reviews, we find inadequate reporting of missing data. So this is very important that we provide enough information in our manuscript to just allow other researchers to make a correct judgment about the final findings of our research. So, for example, we need to report the amount of missing data. It could be the proportion of missing data by each variable that we are interested in, or the proportion of complete cases. Also, comparing the individuals with complete and incomplete data is another important thing, which can help to verify that whether the missing mechanism is missing completely at random or not. And also, it's important, if we can verify, just state that what would be a reason for the missing data in our study. Another important thing in our research was the deficiency in details that were provided for the MI procedure. Again, this is another important thing that replications for the study that was done. So some of the important aspects could be the variables that we are imputing, the type of the variables that we are imputing, and the number of imputations, for example, and what software and what version we are using, because that could help us to identify which method they actually used for imputation. But another important thing is the variables that we are including in the imputation model. That could be the outcome, the interaction effect, and also the nonlinear association. And if we are using some additional information, which we call it auxiliary variables, again, we need to be very specific about those, whether they are incomplete or not, and how they are correlated with the incomplete variables. And some other things regarding the diagnostic checks of the imputation model and the sensitivity analysis. So, so far I was talking about the general multiple imputation procedure, where I mentioned that most implementation of MI assumes missing at random, but in practice, we are often suspect that the missingness would be missing not at random. Then in most cases, implementing MI may lead to biased results. And that's why sensitivity analysis have been suggested to explore the possible departure from the missing at random assumption. So I'm not going through the details of these, I'm just mentioning here that there are two broad frameworks, selection modeling and the pattern mixture modeling, in which we can implement the sensitivity analysis. And the last thing regarding a sensitivity analysis. So doing a sensitivity analysis is not that much straightforward to all the researchers. And the complexity is because we need to specify how the individuals with missing data are different from individuals with complete data. And these differences cannot be estimated or cannot be came up with the observed data that we have. Different methods are available in order to get these differences, or we call it the sensitivity parameter. Some researchers do sensitivity analysis using some extreme values for the possible differences. Some do the sensitivity analysis over a range of possible values, but the most principal way is to obtain these differences from the experts. So it's just saying that we need to collaborate with our clinicians and the experts in the context and verify and specify these possible differences for doing the sensitivity analysis. And these are two papers that I've been working on for performing sensitivity analysis within the MI framework. So one, evaluating the method within the selection effect modeling using a simulation study. Another one is more applied one when try to help researchers to elicit the sensitivity parameters from the expert's opinion.
I had a question about clinical trials related to missing data. Mm-hmm. And when what's missing is the primary outcome. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the outcome could be missing, sometimes the treatment variable, I guess the treatment variable is not usually missing, but the covariates could be missing. But there are different levels, and it's really, I think, considerably more serious in a randomized trial when the outcome's missing compared to a covariate. Yes. But how would you elicit in a sensitivity analysis in a clinical trial where you have experts and they all, it's even a blinded clinical trial, you don't have the results yet, for them to, what's your take on asking them what they think the outcome should be if it's missing?
Yeah, so the common procedure that is suggested is to so whatever their knowledge are based on previous studies or their own experience. But how we can elicit the results, and we suggested is to just is through kind of a training or setting up the meeting and designing some questionnaire and helping them to understand what exactly we are looking for. Because most of the time they think that we are talking about the distribution of the observed data, but in the questionnaire that we have, for example, here, we try to specify, let's say, we want to impute this variable. This is the distribution of the observed data. Now, what we are looking for is the difference of the whatever that are missing and the one that you're observing right now, and trying to provide some examples like worst case scenario and best case scenario and give them some values and also provide them some interpretation that if, for example, you would go with this value, this interpret as this. If that makes sense to you. So it's just a very a step-by-step procedure that you need to go through with the clinicians, and just it has a loop. You get the feedback, and they working on the things again and give the result back to you. So it's not like a very quick process. It takes some time, but it's possible.
As you read through some of these studies, is there any mention of using these techniques on the electronic health records or electronic medical records?
For the sensitivity analysis?
And for imputing
well, the thing is, like performing sensitivity analysis within the MI framework is a very a new area of research, and I think from the time that I graduated, there are a couple of packages available for doing simple sensitivity analysis, but for example, for longitudinal studies, I think this is the probably ongoing research, and still we're thinking about how we can elicit these different sensitivity parameters, especially when we have like a different time points, and it would be really like complicated scenarios when you have to consider how those sensitivity analyses could be associated with each other over time. About most of these like implementation are for medical records, but I don't think there would be really like, can say there is a package or something that you can just use it for the sensitivity.
I would just add, I was a reviewer on a paper just a couple of years ago. Like about 5 or 6 years ago, there was a National Academy panel on missing data in clinical trials, and one of the recommendations was about how to avoid it. And so that was, there was more attention to that than sometimes is given. The article that I reviewed, Rod Little, who was chair of that, and was the lead author of the article, and it was in clinical trials. I would have to track it down, but they talk about the challenge of trying to get the FDA to buy in to, and it was an issue of I believe longitudinal dropout. I actually don't recall whether they had a large elicitation process or whether it was a more of like a pattern mixture model of a series of statistical models that were maybe less driven by expert opinion. But I think there was some mix of that, and the drug eventually was not approved, even though their sensitivity analysis suggested that maybe it could have been or should have been. But there were some issues in differential dropout, and I think that we're in kind of a next generation of methodological issues where that is one that I think still there would be some. I know that Rob has had students where there have been like issues of longitudinal studies where some people have intermittent missing values, some people have dropout, and the possibility of treating those kinds of cases differently. I think these are still some open areas for doing work, and it makes sense to start.
Does this change, this is for everyone, but so let's say you're doing a study with multiple waves. So we do a lot of these studies where there are multiple waves, and then let's say it's 3 waves, and after doing the first wave, the second wave, you decide we want to add some new measure into it, but we didn't collect it for wave 1. Do these types of methods, could then they be used to impute what wave 1 might have responded, and so you could change your methods midway through the study?
Yes. Yes. There are different, as far as I know, there are different methods for imputing the baseline data. One way, which is not very recommended, is the mean imputation. But another one is the multiple imputation that, yes, you can. And in terms of a longitudinal study, I think Tom's former graduate student developed a method where in his simulation study, they showed that if you have like 100% missing data and like earlier waves, you can still get. It's interesting. I haven't tried it yet, but it's interesting.
So it's much more. It depends on the model, but if you have the right model, So like the example that Panteha was just talking about was an intermediate point, on a longitudinal trajectory. And if you have the model right, you can have 100% missing and still recover appropriate intervals. But it is more model dependent at that point.
It seems like that would be the big challenge with temporal data like that, assuming there's no temporal effects, because if you have no baseline data to use in your imputation, it seems like you're making a pretty big assumption.
Yes.
Like I know in the Africa studies, a lot of the measures are developmental, so you expect change over time.
How much can you bank on methods like this, let's say to reviewers, where you're midway through a study and you say, we want to add a measure that didn't exist before? How strong is the support behind this to be able to argue with reviewers where they say, well, you've just added additional measures in the middle of the study design?
As a failed study. Yes, probably you agree with me.
We do it all the
Yeah,
time.
that's a failed
You should have
story.
planned it better
Yes, a
before
study.
launching this.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of reality, though.
In our technologies, that so this is an issue with technologies. Like, we're taught to plan a study 5 years in advance, but technologies are constantly changing. So you can't ever know what are the trends going to be and what people are going to be using. So you may, 2 years down the line, want to ask new types of questions. So reviewers would come back and say either that's a failed study or it's something that you shouldn't have added in these extra measures. But by adding in those extra measures, you can pick up trends in something that there was no way you could have ever known when you planned the study. There are these types of methods that can address that, or it's too early to do that.
My philosophy is not to let the tail wag the dog. So if you have like a new technology, don't say, oh, I can't use it because I didn't start using it in the beginning of the study. But I do think that the simulation results they were referring to situations where there were some previous and some subsequent measures. Of course, that's a situation in which you're going to have better faith, in interpolating rather than extrapolating, and that's. But it's science, and so it's going to evolve.
Concrete example. Let's say 10 years ago we do a lot of work with Facebook. 10 years ago we had Facebook. You could ask, how often do you use Facebook every week? Since then, we have Snapchat, we have Instagram, we have all these new sites. If you're doing a longitudinal study, you want to know, are people using these new technologies? Would you be able to add those questions in and then be able to back extrapolate based on the earlier samples of how much they would be using it also? It's not changing around the intervention or anything, but it's adding in new measures to get an idea for new types of trends that have occurred.
If I understand that, you're imputing data about Snapchat before Snapchat even existed. Right. And it's like a real counterfactual.
But there might, some of what you're suggesting might mean that there's some substitution going on as time goes on. There might be some people who are early Facebook users who then drifted into other things, and the frameworks would allow for then, just general multivariate modeling. You could take a look at whether the people who drifted to the newer technologies, did they differ in baseline on observable quantities? Those might be some interesting questions, but we're not going to impute our way out of all these dilemmas.
For technology like that didn't exist at baseline, I think it's difficult to make concrete or real assumptions about what would have happened. So it could be that Facebook users who are frequent users, when Facebook and Snapchat came out, they may be the ones that use Snapchat and Snapchat and Instagram and not use Facebook at all, because they basically switched the preference. Or it could be that they're also the ones that would take up Snapchat and Instagram more frequently than other, low Facebook users. But those assumptions we don't I don't know, I mean, it's hard to make those assumptions one way or the other.
So I want to make sure to keep us on track so we can continue with it. These are all interesting points, but maybe after.
Alright. So in the second part, I'll start with describing our case study. So we're going to use data that were collected through a HIV prevention intervention trial in South Africa. The study consists of around 38 pregnant women were recruited from 24 clusters or neighborhoods, where the 24 neighborhoods were randomized in the match period to either the intervention or control conditions. So the study focused on the real, the main maternal and child health characteristics, including the hazards of alcohol, HIV, and poor nutrition. The data collection was scheduled to occur at birth, during pregnancy, at birth, and within 6 months, 18 months, 26, and 16 months post-birth, where mothers provided a wide range of information on different maternal characteristics as well as child developmental outcomes. So the aim of this study here is to address the impact of maternal HIV stages on growth outcomes of children in the first 5 years of life. We're especially interested in outcomes, weight and height, which were converted to Z-scores according to WHO age-adjusted standards. So these outcomes were measured over time. We also interested in the maternal HIV status, which is a self-report by mothers and assessed over time. We're envisioning a model which incorporates both fixed and random effects. So as I mentioned before, our outcomes of interest are weight for AZ scores and height for AZ scores. And our model incorporates variables like intervention, time, the maternal HIV stages, and the interaction between HIV and time.
What about the child's HIV status?
This is actually one of the exclusion criteria. So we had 17 HIV positive children in our study, which we decided to exclude. I mean, not we. In previous studies that were done, they excluded HIV positive. So the sample is just uninfected HIV uninfected children.
What's the range for those outcomes?
The Z scores? Good question. So we have extreme values for these outcomes, and as Mary Jane suggested, we decided to, based on the distribution that we observed, we decided to go from the -5 to 5. But we did observe like 17 or I don't know. So we have some large values.
Those, there are a lot of those values. Even -5.
Yes.
-7 is like the smallest kid in the universe.
Seriously? -7? Oh.
Yes. But yeah, and we have this problem in all studies.
At one point, I think we had like an average Z-score like -2 or something.
Mm-hmm.
One of those.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure at one point Mary Jane said that it was measured, things were measured wrong.
Yeah, exactly. A similar thing that we reported in the manuscript, saying that this could be an error in the measurements when they convert the kilograms or grams to
Z-scores. Or measured in the first place.
Yeah. So our model also accounts for the subject level and neighborhood level random intercept as well as random slope for time. After considering the exclusion criteria, which was HIV positive, children and also the twins and triplet birth. I mean, we didn't consider those. We came up with the 1086 subjects. Here, I presented the proportion of missing data on the outcomes and exposure, and you can see that the rate of missing data actually increases for all the variables over time. We're also looking at the differences in the important characteristics between individuals with complete and incomplete data, and we found that individuals with missing data were more likely to be single and used alcohol.
Is that the baseline for married, or is that at the time?
At the time.
So married or living at 6 months? Or
Yes. Yeah.
But if they're missing, the kid's variable, but you have the mother, but you don't have kid data?
We had the mothers, but this, not all of them. So we compared the like a more maternal characteristics, not the kids.
You're saying the cases that were missing the height or the weight outcome.
So yes, so these are the individuals that have complete values on the outcome and HIV status. So we compared those with those ones that have incomplete. And we compared different maternal characteristics, like alcohol, intimate partner violence, education, different characteristics.
So just a word about the study, and a mother brings her baby in, you're taking the measurements, and if you're recording the mother's marital status and alcohol use at that time, what would be the reasons for why the baby wasn't evaluated for height and weight at that visit? Why would the mother's there, has shown up, and you've got their mother's status? Why do you think the baby would?
I mean, the possible reasons that, as far as I know, is sometimes the child is living with the grandparents or the caregiver, and they actually move the child to the other area, is that what I call it? Yeah.
At Cape Town is where they have their money at the top, but then they would leave their children in the wilderness to be raised by the grandparents and uncles.
Yeah.
And so sometimes the child they themselves.
Yeah. This is one of the things.
Migration.
Interesting. The aim of this study is to illustrate the two multi-level, multiple imputation strategies for handling missing data to address the impact of maternal HIV on the growth outcomes. Now, I want to talk about a little bit about the imputation procedure that I mentioned in the first part. So I talked about the fully conditional specification and the joint model that we can use for imputing missing data. So these two approaches have been advanced over recent years and widely available in most of the statistical software packages. However, when the underlying design leads to longitudinal cluster data, these methods actually treat the repeated measure of the same variable as another distinct variable in an imputation model. So what does it mean? I'll just show you here. Let's suppose that this is our longitudinal data set. So we have the ID for each subject, and we have the time of the assessment. So you can here see that, for example, we have the response for ID1 at the different time points. So we call it this as a long format data set. When you want to impute, let's say, missing data in Y variable using the approaches that I mentioned, you need to transpose the data in a Y format. Now, for each ID here, we have response measured at time point 1, time point 2, and time point 3. So you can see that the one variable here, the longitudinal, now we have like 3 distinct variables. So you can imagine that how the imputation become like very large when you add like more imputed variables. So when you have a large imputation model, then you would have a convergence issue due to the high correlation between these variables, especially the repeated measures of the same variables, and also the perfect prediction for the categorical variable. But more importantly, these methods are not proper for accounting for the correlation structure of the repeated measures. You can use some sort of I don't know, things like imputing separately for each clusters, or use the indicators for each cluster as another variable in the imputation model. However, previous studies suggested not to do that because this may lead to result bias, especially the variance, implementation of the variance. But multi-level multiple imputation strategies are designed for accounting multi-level structure of the data in the imputation model. So similar to what I explained before, you can implement these multi-level procedures within the FCS and JM framework. Most implementation of the FCS-based methods are based on a series of univariate linear mixed effect models, one for each incomplete variable, and also most implementation of the joint model imputation uses a multivariate extension of a linear mixed effect model. Over the past 2 years, there have been several packages available, especially in R, that you can implement multi-level multiple imputation. However, they differ in their functionality and ability to account for the random effects. For example, a few of them can account for the random slope variation. Some of them most of them are limited to the 2-level data structure, and some of them can handle missing data in categorical variables, some of them not, and maybe 1 or 2 of them can account for the interaction terms and the nonlinear association in the imputation model. So today I'm going to focus on 2 methods. One of them is within the FCS framework. So for doing that, I used the Blvd application, which is a standalone application developed by Craig Anders and his colleague from UCLA. The application seems very flexible. It can handle up to 3 level data structure, which is good news. And how it works and account for the random effects is like it incorporates the cluster means as another covariate in imputation model. In this case, it can account for the between cluster association. So let's say you have 2 level data structure. First, it imputes the level 1 variables, and then calculate the cluster means for all the completed variables, and use the cluster means as another covariate, and impute the level 2 incomplete variables using this cluster means. So it can handle missing data in like any type. Any type. It can handle binary, category, ordinal, and also the continuous one. And the nice thing about the application is that you can account for the interaction terms in the imputation model. Another method that I used is based on the joint modeling framework, is known as a longitudinal factor model, which has been developed by Tom, former graduate student. We implement this procedure in the SAS program CMC. So this method was designed to handle missing data in high-dimensional data sets. It actually is designed to economize the number of imputation model parameters. So it uses the factor analysis strategy to characterize the cross-sectional association at each time point, and then it uses the linear mixed effect model for the factor scores to reflect the longitudinal pattern of association between the factor scores. In terms of imputation, it can account for both continuous and categorical variables. So in this case, it's very flexible. Now, going back to our case study, we want to impute our outcomes and our HIV status, which had some missing data over time. In line with the recommendation in the literature, we included all the variables in the analysis model, in our imputation model. We also include the auxiliary variables, which are those variables that predict missing data or the probability of missingness. Here we have like 9 auxiliary variables, like the depressive symptoms, alcohol use, marital status, income, food insecurity, violence, and some demographics. For imputation, we use 13 imputations for both FCS-based and the joint modeling method, and then we compare the results obtained from the imputation method with the linear mixed effect model.
Is the 30 kind of a rule of thumb, or how did you write
Yes. So the rule of thumb is that you have a look at the percentage of missingness on your variable, and usually that percentage would be equal to the number of imputation. For example, we observed the maximum proportional missingness for us was like 24%. So things like 30 imputations would be enough. But just feel free to increase the number of imputations, but it just, makes it the process.
In the old days, the answer was 5.
Right.
Yeah.
And a lot of packages use 5, but now with data storage not being nearly as costly as it was back in the day, the old rules of thumb have given way to new rules of thumb.
So the predictors of missingness, could you have included like previous age or height or weight measurements in predicting the current the history of height and weight and predicting missingness?
Yeah. So using these two approaches, we don't have to worry about because we impute data in a long format, so we automatically account for the previous observed. So we are not using a wide format in order to account the previous measurement separately. We automatically, similar to the mixed effect model, we use those measurements that available from the earlier assessments. So these two plots summarize the estimates for the interaction effect between HIV and time across the 3 different methods. On the y-axis, we have the mean difference for each outcome, and on the x-axis, we have difference in time trend. So just looking at the findings, we don't see that much difference across the 3 methods, although you may notice that here using some methods may lead to a different interpretation of the results. So more specifically, we're looking at the estimates of the mean differences, the time-specific HIV effect across the 3 methods. So you can see that apparently the maternal HIV is associated with the reduced growth at birth. However, the impact seems to be disappear after birth. Another thing, again, it seems like selecting different methods may lead to different interpretation of the results.
To me, the similarities here is actually mostly good news. It's like, the method isn't going to, like you can do a lot of different things and if you are in a situation where the results are slightly different, like in this one on the left-hand side, if I'm understanding correctly, the linear mixed model, is that a complete case analysis in linear mixed model? And so in that one, you would probably say, you trust the other two a little bit more, which would be a little more circumspect about that. On the previous page, if I remember correctly, the longitudinal factor model was significant. The other model-based method wasn't.
Are there covariates imputed in this, or is only weight for HC scores, height for HC?
No, actually we imputed the HIV also.
HIV, mother's HIV, for those 60, 80 or so mothers.
And also for those, because we included the auxiliary variables in the model, so we had some of the variables.
In the linear mixed model?
No, not the mixed model, just for the imputation model.
Okay, you probably want those auxiliary variables in there, wouldn't you?
For the linear mixed model. Oh, okay.
Also, it's probably important to note that the linear mixed model is also doing imputation.
Yes, considering all the
integrates out all of those perfectly. So
yes.
Effectively, it's not 30 integrations. It's an infinite number of imputations, but for that particular model.
Yes, that's true.
Are you then refitting that linear mixed model with the other two?
Yes.
Okay. So that model is a little different than the imputation model.
Yes, because it has the auxiliary variables.
The imputation, but not in the analysis. So if you put those variables in, you might get almost the same thing. I don't know.
Well, the auxiliary variables are those variables that cannot be included in the analysis variables. So they just help.
They can't be used as predictors.
So in that case, they're not auxiliary variables. It's just the covariates or the other variables included. No, we could do that. I mean, the main reason that we choose a simple analysis model was just the first to show that we can implement these two methods.
Linear, by the way, changing subject slightly. I'm sorry. Jump all over. It's a random intercept or random intercept and slope.
Random intercept and slope.
But it's a good suggestion that for there would be variations on the linear mixed model that we could look at and compare. The point I was making earlier, it actually to me is pretty good news. I mean, it's sort of bad news in the sense that like there's not a method. It's like, this establishing itself as superior and different or something. But on the other hand, if you have different strategies that are leading to similar messages, that's actually good news in the science of it.
So just coming back to complete case, did you say one of those was a complete case at 6 months or something? Which one was the complete case?
This is just a linear mixed effect model.
Right.
So the linear mixed effect, as my understanding is that if you have missing, so you still account for any information measured at the prior time points, but you may have a missing at the single time. So I tried the complete cases when I used the wide format data set, but it didn't converge because of so many variables that I included.
Interrupt, but maybe better called complete observation, because I doubt you didn't throw out observations.
Not here.
So it's all of the observations for this data. It's so complete observations. So somebody could be missing one point, but they're still in the analysis.
But if they had a missing covariate, they would fall out.
Fall out, yeah.
Which was the mother's HIV.
For the mother's HIV. So this is the point that we think that we may gain by using multiple imputation because we have the missing data also in the covariates. If we have on the outcomes, we definitely there's not much benefit by doing multiple imputation. But when you have the missing data in the covariates, so you may lose that whole information at a specific time point. So that's why. And there could be so many reasons why we get the similar results here. One, because of we didn't have so many covariates in our analysis model, which was completely observed and helped to, imputing our missing data. That could be one of them. And another one could be the pattern of missingness that we observe in our outcome exposure. So in most cases, I assume that we have missing data on both outcome and exposure. So it could be like it, or the third one, it could be the fact that the auxiliary variables that we use are not that much predictive of the missing data or missingness. Right. So in summary, multiple imputation is a useful statistical method for handling missing data. It can reduce the bias and improve efficiency compared to complete case analysis when the missing data assumption is MAR. However, there are some specific scenarios under MAR and MNAR when you get the valid results using the complete case analysis. But we need to remember that multiple imputation is not the miracle, and you have to think about whether you gain something by doing multiple imputation. Think about whether it's likely to correct bias or increase the precision, whether we have any additional information or auxiliary variables that can predict the missing data or missingness. Because, again, we need to realize that by setting up a poor imputation model, we may get the biased results. So it's important. And the last thing is that it's important to think about get more benefit by doing MI when you have missing data in your covariate. So in that case, you can recover information in the covariates from the exposure and outcome, which is fully observed. But vice versa, it would be similar to our case. You get the maybe not that much benefit. So in terms of adopting a standard multiple imputation approach for multi-level data, I mentioned that you get a large imputation model that may lead to a convergence issue and maybe, I don't know, to get some biased results. However, you definitely, if you run your model, you may get biased results because just remember that these type of methods cannot preserve the multi-level structure of the data. The methods that I applied seems very flexible in terms of accounting for the multi-level data structure. Again, they can introduce bias if the imputation model not setting up appropriately. In our case study, all the three methods that we applied showed similar results. They're saying that HIV effect on growth is associated. They're associated at birth, but the impact seems to be not that much overwhelming after birth. So at this stage, we cannot really make a strong recommendation to use the FCS based or the joint modeling based method, because this is just an application that we show here, and definitely more studies using simulation study needed to compare the statistical properties of these two methods. But just in terms of my experience of implementing these two methods, I had some problems when I increased the number of variables in the imputation model, so I had a convergence problem. Although I included like 9 auxiliary variables and I had random effects, and it was complicated enough, but again, when I increased the number of variables, I had the convergence issue. About the LF model, although it seems very flexible of handling so many variables, but the implementation is it was challenging for me. There is no software available for this method yet, so I had some difficulties just implementing this in the SAS. And hopefully, so in the future, we could make it as a software and makes it accessible for researchers. In implementation of this method, I had some problems regarding the interpolation between the parameter estimates. So then, in future, that would be nice to think about some efficient ways of monitoring the linear combination of the parameters. And finally, as I mentioned before, definitely the further research is required to identify and compare the statistical properties of these two methods and consider like more complex scenarios in practice. So these are some references. These are the systematic reviews references if you like, and these are the multi-level imputation references. And I would like to thank Pham and Sean who developed the LF model, and also Mary Jane who provided me the data set, and my colleagues in Australia. Thank you.
So the blimp was in R. Is that an R library?
No, it's just a standalone application. You can just
it's standalone. Okay.
Yeah.
In
It's free.
The LF, was that Proc MCMC?
We use the Proc MCMC to implement the method, but it's not the package that you can call.
Right.
So it's like
a lot of code.
Raw code, yeah.
So I guess, when you thinking that, what advice do you have in presenting the data? And one question that seems to come to my mind is, it's not only of interest what the end result is, but also of interest like what's causing the missingness. So that's the imputation model part of it. Mm-hmm. So do you present both? There's a story to be told, which is, okay, does maternal HIV status affect growth? But then the other part that I think is as important, particularly for future studies, is what are the predictors of the missingness?
Yes.
And so how would you present both? And what were the predictors here? What were the big players in terms of what predicted missing?
Well, I think my understanding is that in this specific study, we have the we just guessing that most of these missingness, for example, that we have for the child outcomes is because of the movements of the mothers. So that could be, the migration could be one of the predictors. But unfortunately, we didn't have that much complete data on that. So I was thinking that just adding this variable as a predictor, it makes the model worse, because then we have to impute so many values for the migration. So it wasn't like we had probably for the other outcomes, we have so many developmental outcomes, but the percentage of missingness for those are higher than the height for age and weight for age that we have. So that's why I just focused on the maternal characteristics that we have. But in reality, yes, the first thing you need to think about what would be a reason, and the reason was probably the migration, but we have that problem with that.
If I can just interject, it was news to me today when we had this discussion. I didn't know about that migration issue, but it's a reminder of I think of your question as being focused on the science. And going back to what Panteha was talking about earlier, I'm remembering, when I was an assistant professor, I remember doing multiple imputation on a project and writing up like a one-page, material for a methods section. I gave it to the lead author, doctor on the paper, and when it got it to print, it said, to handle the missing data, we used the method of multiple imputation of Rubin 1987. In other words, it would have been impossible for anyone to reconstruct what I had done or anything like that. And I do think that the kinds of issues that you were driving at with your question and earlier in the discussion, I think are really important to draw in. And I think that maybe one comment also on the environment we're in now is that there's less pressure now on the space constraints because you could have technical appendices and stuff to articles in most cases, and so I just generally like the spirit of what Panteha is doing, and I appreciate the question because it was
yeah, I think those are really key issues, and thanks for your presentation, very insightful. I think to me, I'm not a multiple imputation expert, but the assumptions you're making when you're assuming whether it's completely at random, missing at random, or not missing at random, I think those are very, very important in terms of trying to figure out, trying to rationalize the predictor, like the reasons for missing. So that even the migration example, that you gave, which is interesting, but so you're making the assumption that the babies that stay behind with their grandparents are, their profiles are similar to the babies that stay with their moms. But I think if there's additional literature and research out there to either refute that or confirm that, that would be important in terms of making sure that your assumptions are valid. So it could be the healthier babies stay with their grandparents because the mom doesn't have to really worry too much about it, or it might be the other way around.
The comment though there is that to the extent that other variables that predict migration are in the model, it won't necessarily induce bias. And to me, that I think is why when you have more than one highly multivariate method, that might explain why they're giving similar answers. Because even though the models are a little bit different in their structure, they're both including enough variables that are observed. It might be that the residual bias associated with not having a variable like that in the model isn't so great. That would be my intuition of it.
Let's thank our speaker.